Why we do what we do. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about why archivists collect certain collections and how we determine why we collect them, and a little bit of history about the archives, just enough to give you a little bit of prep for Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. So, in this lecture, I am defining the words archives both as a noun and as a verb. Now, as a noun, archives are collections of historical documents or records providing information about a place, an institution, or a group of people. As a verb, archives is a place or space to house archival collections. These could be photographs, documents, diaries, letters, and believe it or not, we even have digital archives, such as Born Digital. But in this lecture, I'm going to talk about more of the physical, tangible materials. Later on in our textbook, we'll talk again about appraisal. Just so you understand, when I use the word appraisal, it's the process of determining whether records or other materials have permanent archival value to be selected and housed in the archives. Now, we keep archives for cultural, historical, and social reasons. They have value in our society in knowing how things have developed. Archival collections are important because it gives us an understanding of the present depending on our understanding of the past. The historical record is important to future generations because they contribute to memory and identity. Now, the archivist has the difficult role of determining the value of records and other collections for preservation. This will ensure their archives has collections that are meaningful, they're relevant, and they're research worthy. So, why do archivists collect? The next slide shows you an artifact that was retained in the Ford Motor Archives through the appraisal process. Now, this letter was written in 1934. The letter is in the collections, was found in the collections of the Archives and Research Library at the Henry Ford Museum. And it reads, "I have drove Fords exclusively when I could get away with one. For sustained speed and freedom from trouble, the Ford has got every other car's skin. Even if my business hasn't been strictly legal, it doesn't hurt anything to tell you what a fine car you got in the V8. So, why did the archivist keep this letter? Questions. What evidence does it show? Evidence of a satisfied customer? Does that make it unique? Well, not necessarily. Well, certainly Ford Motor Company must have received numerous letters from satisfied customers. So again, I have to ask the question, what makes this letter special? Why keep it after all these years? You see, the archivist determined that this letter was unique. It had more than evidential value. It had what we call intrinsic value based on the signature of the letter. The letter was signed, "Yours truly, Clyde Champion Barrow," of the infamous Bonnie and Clyde, American outlaws and robbers whose exploits captured the attention of the American public during the so-called public enemy era between 1931 and 1934. The intrinsic value of this letter has substantial public interest because of its direct association with someone famous or historically significant. Appraisal theory came about because of a need to preserve governmental records, but has evolved when concerns arose about lost information. Here's a little bit of history for you now, and you'll read these names in Chapter 3. The most influential archival theorist was Sir Hilary Jenkinson, a British archivist, born 1882, died 1961. In 1922, Jenkinson wrote about the moral defense of archives. Now, Jenkinsonian influenced archivists. Now, when I say Jenkinsonian influence, I'm hyphenating that word because there were archivists that just follow his theories. So, Jenkinsonian influenced archivists kept records. They did not select. For Jenkinson, the records creator was responsible for determining which records should be transferred to the archives for preservation. since in his view, records are impartial, the task of selecting is merely a matter of choosing documents that best describe what happened. But Jenkinson and other European archivists of his era tended to look backward to a time when there was little enough to keep. There were very little production of records, and the number of surviving documents was so little that archivists were ecstatic that everything was saved. So unfortunately, this became a problem later on. The world of records production and duplication changed all that. In fact, by the 1940s, the introduction of duplication through photocopies made a distinction between handwriting and typed documents irrelevant. Either one could be rapidly reproduced in large numbers, and with little true distinction between the original and the copy. And pretty soon, massive amounts of government records were being created, duplicated, and reduplicated, and so forth. Back in the day, it was the creators of the records who made decisions, and they generally were not interested in the archival records as their training did not include a concern for long-term importance. The records managers. In fact, records creators adopted 4 solutions to the problem and used whichever made sense at the time. So let me give you some examples of how they dealt with this problem, starting with number 1. Well, let's just throw the old stuff out. Yes, that was actually one of the solutions. Let's just throw the old stuff out. How about number 2? Well, let's buy more and more file cabinets and keep everything. Well, that didn't bode very well. How about number 3? Okay, can we hire a records manager? Now, at that time, the records manager's primary mandate was to reduce costs, not preserve. Or how about this, number 4? Dump the whole mess in the archives. None of these were very helpful to the archivist, especially number 4, which happened more often than you can think. And oh, yes, I've seen archives filled with boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff, and they haven't been processed. They were so old, nobody knew what they were. It was like a madhouse in the archives. So what happens? Here comes along an American archivist, T.R. Schellenberg, who questions Jenkinson's theory as keeper of the archives, not selector. Where Jenkinson's concept was one of purely administrative archives, well-rooted in European history, Schellenberg's emphasis was on the secondary user, the historian, and yes, you. Schellenberg's theory is rooted in the American documentary experience. Now think about it. The United States is a young country compared to Europe, and collections were less about documenting government's administrative action and more about our history and cultural experience. The past tradition of passive preservation and protection of records, archivists now had to do the dirty work of selecting. An archivist was now asking the questions. Who created the document? Why were they created and for what purpose? What is the relationship between the creator and the record? And so forth. So the archivist must look at the information within the record and consider its use for research, including institutional history and scholarly endeavors. Now I'm saying records, but I also mean collections too. So let me explain. When I use the word record, I'm talking about government records, business records. But when I talk about papers, it's more personal papers, papers of families, papers of our presidents. These are very, very important. They tell us a lot about our history. So the archivist has to look at the information within the record or the papers and consider its use for research, including institutional history, as well as scholarly endeavors. Schellenberg understood the historical and informational value of the collections to researchers, and Schellenberg expected historically trained archivists to be able to recognize a valuable document when they saw one, or at least he hoped. He hoped for that. After Schellenberg's death in 1970, additional theories were introduced, which evolved into 5 appraisal values to select records. These 5 appraisals were used to help them determine, what to keep. It's kind of a selection process for archival records and acquired collections. So let's talk about those 5 levels of appraisal. Number 1. Do the records have any operating, administrative, legal, or fiscal values? This is really important in records management, in archiving particular records. So the ongoing day-to-day administrative affairs of the records creator. This particular appraisal value is used to assess the importance of the institutional records and or business records in general. 2, do the records have evidential value? In a historical sense, records that show the existence and achievements are useful for ensuring accountability within organizations and for writing organizational administrative histories, basically evidence of what the institution or company did business-wise. And when I say institution, I can mean a college. If I say company, manufacturing company, or like Ford Motor Company. How about intrinsic value? The National Archives describes intrinsic value as, I'm quoting here now, those historical materials that should be retained in their original form rather than as copies. That is intrinsic value. And these records have qualities and characteristics that make their original physical form the only archivally acceptable form for preservation. And there are 9 qualities or characteristics used to help determine if a collection or item has intrinsic value, which I will talk a couple slides down from here. 4, the record's arrangement and physical condition. Now, records whose arrangement, indexing, or other identifying information makes it easy to locate needed information are more likely to warrant retention than records containing similar documentation that are extremely difficult to use. And records that have deteriorated to the point that the information they contain is not readable are not accepted. Believe you me, if you get some records journal that is so deteriorated that you can't even read it, why are you keeping it? You really can't, because you can never use it. And lastly, relationship to other records in the archives. For example, various social work collections from the New England area would be collected because of relationship in the field of social work organizations and the state of Massachusetts. We'll say, for example. Or let's say Captain William Smith, a 19th century captain of the ship Bennington. If I have the personal papers of Captain William Smith and someone brings in the records of the voyage of the ship Bennington, I'm going to want that collection, even if Captain William Smith commandeered the Bennington for only 2 years. These 2 collections have relationship and will better support researchers in the maritime history. So let's stop here and do a quick review. Archivists use these 5 values of appraisal to determine what will be selected to keep for preservation and use in research. This is an important aspect of appraising in-house archives, or what we call the institutional archives, institutional records. You work for a college, and so the institutional records of the college is how you're going to appraise those institutional records created by the institution. But a record does not have to have all 5 of the values. These guidelines to help the archivist determine what to keep and what to discard when evaluating in-house records. Because what if you have records that are donated or acquired? They're not institutional. These would be collections, again, not created by the institution, but donated or acquired. So let's talk about donated items. The archivist can appraise the collection before it is accepted to make sure it is something that will serve their research needs. So if you work in an archives that is interested in local history and you get a collection of family papers of your community or the founding fathers of your community, I mean, that's important. So you're going to appraise it and say, wow, that has relevance because we collect materials about our local history. So the archivist is going to appraise those kind of materials completely on their own authority, using their appraisal guidelines. And they'll require research on the donated collection to ensure it's something they want. So it's not unusual to see a collection and say, boy, is this something we could use? You do a little bit of research on it. You want to make sure you're not going to turn away something that's really important. These are the papers that you seek out, that you are hoping, that when something is donated, you're going to look for that. So it's got to support the interest of the archives. As for acquired collections institution seeks out through purchases. Yep, sometimes archival materials are so sought out for that there's a budget for that. They already know the collection is something they want because they establish an acquisitions policy, guidelines for the type of materials they want to gather. Certainly at a maritime museum, they are, I'll give you an example, the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, Maine. They collect anything and everything about shipbuilding, captains, sailors, any trade during the voyages of the ships in that are New England area, especially Maine. And there are auction houses that sell maritime materials, and they will look out for anything that is part of their collection that is an appraisal policy, and they will set money aside for that. Another example is Simmons College Special Collections of Social Work Records. These schools, they support the School of Social Work, the students in the program, and faculty as well. So they're going to look out for stuff like that. They'll look out for any records that will support their curriculum in the social work college. So historical societies, local history or family papers would be sought out. Even genealogical archives. For a museum, whatever subject that museum supports, their exhibitions, they're going to look out for specific collections that will support their exhibitions. It could be science, art or artists, or history. Now, of the 5 values of appraisals, let's talk about intrinsic values. Now, intrinsic value has long been used by archivists to describe historical materials that should be retained in their original form rather than as copies, which is why copies of a collection are not considered of archival value. This is very, very important. If you get, say, a box of papers or records, somebody says, hey, I have a collection here. It's of the old textile mill that was in the town back in 1855 to 1910. I've got these records of the textile mill. Until you look at them, and they're all Xerox copies. They're not even the original records. Okay, but they're about the textile mill in your town. So what are you going to do with them? Are you going to put them in the archives? No, you're not. But you can take those copies as a gift and put them in your vertical file. So it can support research. Hopefully down the road you'll actually have the real records. But for now, you have copies and they go in your vertical files. They're not archival at all. Trust me, an archivist does not want to fill their shelves with copies of originals. That is not in archives. Think glass negatives versus a photocopy of a negative. Think an old typewriter from 1880 and a picture of an 1880 typewriter. Okay? That's the difference, copy versus original. Now, there are 9 characteristics to describe what intrinsic means. Items considered of archival value do not have to have all 9 intrinsic qualities, but you have this guideline. So let's start with the first one. Records with unique physical forms. These are documents preserved in their original form as evidence of technological development. For example, a series of early press copies, glass plate negatives, or wax cylinder sound recordings may be retained. A selection broad enough to provide evidence of technological development would be considered to have value. Records with aesthetic or artistic qualities may include photographs, pencil, ink, or watercolor sketches, maps, architectural drawings, or engraved and or printed forms such as bounty land warrants or slave deeds. Records with unique or curious physical features might include quality and texture of paper, color, wax seals, imprints, and watermarks, inks, unusual bindings. Records of age that provides a quality of uniqueness. Now, generally, records of earlier dates are of more significance than records of later dates. Now, this can be because of a historical change in functions and activities of the creators of the records, the scarcity of earlier records, a change in record-keeping practices, or a combination of these. But age can be a factor even with comparatively recent records. The earliest records concerning, for example, the development of the radio industry or of nuclear power could have intrinsic value because of age. Sometimes people think that archives has only old things, but no, not necessarily. What if you have archives, collections of social groups in your community, and you keep collections of all the different social groups, women's groups, any kind of organization, society, Rotary, early Rotary records. But what if there was a group that started in 2005? Maybe it was a group of people that got together that started a community archives of some sort. I don't know. And they disbanded in 2010. It's 5 years worth. It's not old, like comparatively old, like 1920, but it's important. It's an important organization that started and only lasted for 5 years. You'll accept it. So not everything has to be old in the archives. You have to determine its historical value, evidential value, its research value, intrinsic value, all these things you have to determine will people be interested in the future in research. Another one is records of value for use in exhibits. These normally have several qualities and characteristics that give them intrinsic value. Records with exhibit value impressively convey the immediacy of an event, depict a significant issue, or impact a sense of the person who is the subject originator of the record. In these cases, the impact of the original document cannot be equaled by a copy. Here's an example. Let's say the 100th anniversary of your community in 1950. And all the newsletters and photographs and posters and letters from the legislature, blah, whatever. Those are great. Those are great for your local history and great for exhibits, especially at the 200th anniversary or 150th anniversary and so forth. How about records with questionable authenticity, questionable date, questionable author, or other characteristics that is significant and ascertainable by physical examination? You see, some records are of doubtful authenticity or have information or content that is open to question. Although it is impossible to foresee which documents will be questioned in the future, certain type of documents are well known to have potential for controversy. And if the original records are extant, handwriting signatures can be examined, paper age can be ascertained, and other physical tests can be performed. In some cases, the controversy can be resolved by recourse to the original item. Again, examination of the handwriting, the age of the paper, or the original negative of the photostatic print. While in other cases, the item will not be conclusive, but will provide the researcher with the best evidence from which to draw conclusions. Let's say original photographs of UFOs, for example. Oh, there are UFO archives. How about general substantial public interest because of direct association with famous or historically significant people, places, things, issues, or events? Remember the letter written by Clyde Barrow to Ford Motor Company? This criterion is not only the most difficult to apply, but also the most important in terms of the volume of records to which it could be applied. It could be used to justify preserving in original form almost all permanently valuable records because of their historical importance. On the other hand, if limited to records of unusual significance, it would be used to justify disposal of almost all original records. It's very difficult. So your judgment as the archivist is a crucial factor in determining whether there is general or substantial public interest, whether the association is direct, and whether the subject is famous or historically significant. Generally, those series with high concentration of such information should be preserved. And records with significant documentation of the establishment or continuing legal basis of an agency or institution, or records with significant documentation of the formulation of policies. I always think about bylaws, charters and things of that nature. So basically, any records that document important actions or events that document the shift in functions of the agency or institution, like board members or president of institution. Also, records that reflect policy decision changes, characteristics that give policy records value or are the origin of the records at the highest executive levels, the breadth of the effect, the important subject matter. So I believe that bylaws and changes in functioning organizations, I think those are all important in there. Now, when we talk about selecting and appraising government or institutional records, we are talking about the systematic destruction of documents. So let me explain what that means, okay? Because archivists don't destroy things. But when I say destruction of documents, I'm actually talking about the record manager. So they remove records because their function is retention schedules. If a retention schedule has expired, they're going to just pull it out and destroy it. But records managers who work with archivists, they'll just send those records that have to be removed because their retention schedule expired. They go to the archivist. Now the archivist decides from these removed records what really is archival. Okay? So what they don't pick, they will destroy. These records, they're just going to get rid of them because they don't want them. And these could be like medical records. I mean, any personal records that have addresses and phone numbers, things like that, we don't keep that stuff. So we actually make a decision to determine what to keep and what to destroy when it comes to records. So archivist has to decide what to keep based on its value for future research. They look at the historical informational value. So even if the use of the information changes in the future, archivists are going to go beyond the five values. And they're going to start asking deeper questions when you look at these records. So why, what isn't kept is destroyed, but what they do keep, they have to determine, why it's important to keep. This is something that the historians get upset about. There's a contention with historians, and certainly through their eyes. It's understandable because in their mind, all records are valuable. But in reality, archives can't keep all records that were retained and then removed because of the retention schedule. They can't keep all that stuff. So we have to determine the deeper questions about those records. Okay, we have to really prove why it's important to keep. Does it have historical informational value, research value? But now let's talk about something different, not about records. Let's talk about donated or acquired collections. Now, these are never destroyed. They're quite different from records. If a collection is ever deaccessioned, it will not be destroyed. You may work in archives that took all kinds of things, but they had no relevance to the archives appraisals. Maybe the librarian took something a person brought in and gave it to the archives and put it aside, but it turns out it doesn't have any place in the archives. The archivist isn't going to destroy it. What the archivist is going to do, a good archivist, is going to find a new home for that collection. They will put that call out, like on a library list, archive listserv, library listserv, say we have a collection of such and such. We do not need it. We're deaccessioning it. Is there an institution that would like this collection? And they usually do find a new home for that. So that's the difference between institutional records that have a specific form and function versus personal papers. Archival appraisal is a very difficult function in the archival world. And old theories were questioned. Remember Jenkinson, European archives, and new theories. They're expanded upon to address these concerns. That's T.R. Schellenberg. Archivists still struggle with what to keep and what to destroy when it comes to records, but they also struggle with what to keep and what to deaccession. They want to make sure that they deaccession, they better make sure they want to, because once it's deaccessioned and given away, it is forever gone. Why? Because these are original, one of a kind. Think of the librarian who does collection development. They're going to determine what they want to bring in their libraries, what kind of books they want to purchase. Or they get a box of books and determine what they want to keep for the collection, what they want to put in the book sale, what they want to get rid of. They don't have to worry about, is it the right thing I did? I should have kept it. Because they can always go to secondary market and get the book they wanted. The book that they decided to keep, they can get again. The book that is stolen, not returned, they can get again. But in archives, you determine if you want to keep a particular collection. If you say no, I don't want it, it's gone, okay? And if you have a collection in your archives that's been lifted, it is forever gone. So we take our appraisal policies very seriously. It's very different from library collection development. Our collection development is based on our appraisal policy. So that sort of tells you our role as archivists. Okay, and so that ends our lecture.